All right, I'm here.
There she is.
Yay. Now I just have to access the thumb drive where I have all the information. Thank goodness I put it on a thumb drive, so that is working.
Well, we're really glad to have you, Dana. I think this is the first one that you've come on to do. And so, we normally do this every Monday morning. We have a lot of our regulars on. And so we're really, really glad to have you here. For those that don't know, this is Dana Sparks. She's the managing broker at Maximum Greater Atlanta, and she is a rock star. So we are very blessed to have her teach us today. And so I just want you to know how much we appreciate you, Dana. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Well, I appreciate being here, and here we go. I'm so honored to be here, and I'm really excited to teach this class or this little mastermind about repairs. Repairs are such a crazy, crazy, crazy issue. And as a broker, having to, is this all, well, just in general, as a broker, having to deal with repair issues, deals falling apart, walk through day before closing, it is definitely a trying issue, and these issues can kill the deal at the last minute. And what we want to do is try to prevent that from happening. And so I'm really excited, Alan and Ming. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this mastermind to help agents plan in advance to avoid these issues the day of closing, the day before closing, and have just what's supposed to be a really, really exciting, wonderful time turn into just a nightmare, potentially a no deal, and that's just horrible. So what I would cancel. What I would like to do is go over a couple of ideas with everybody, the things that we train, teach our agents at the brokerage, as well as in the classes that I teach. And then I'd love to field any questions. Does that work?
Works great here.
Okay.
We're
So
all ears.
let me make this big, and then let me share my, so am I hostess with the mostest?
You shouldn't. You're on as a co-host. But, if I need to make you host, I will.
Okay,
But
let me
you should
see if
you
I
should
can
be able to
share my
see.
screen, and then let's see if all right. Can you guys all see my screen?
Special stipulations to consider.
We go. All right, let me make this a little bit bigger, and then I'm going to cover everything. So this is a document that I just have put everything together for everyone in a document to make everything easy. We do share this as at the school, in the classes we teach, and again at the brokerage level. But we have another document, special stipulations to consider. This one is just, I narrowed it down to repairs. Um, and so bear with me, I'm on a computer I have not used in a while. So we're going to start at the beginning, and we're going to start with due diligence, because that's where you start when you're working with a buyer before repairs ever become an issue. First, you have to have a contract that's subject to a due diligence period. So what does that mean? A due diligence period means that a seller gives the buyer the opportunity or the option, it's called an option contract, the option to terminate a contract within a certain time frame for any or no reason. So this is a really, really special time frame for both buyer and seller. Why? Well, this is the time frame for a buyer to do everything a buyer needs to do to help them make the decision. Are they going to go through with the deal, or are they going to terminate and get their earnest money back and go find another property? So there's all kinds of things a buyer can do. They can have the home inspected. They can have the roof inspected. They can check it out for termites. They can check the zoning. They can check and make sure they can get hazard insurance. They can check the commute to work. They can see, look on Google Earth and see if they're building a nuclear power plant behind the cedar cypress trees. They can make sure it's in the correct school district. Our school districts change all the time. They can check and make sure they like it, their significant other likes it, their family likes it. They can make sure their loan's going to go through. There's some other protections for the loan, as we know, but there are all types of things that a buyer does during this time frame. One of them is a home inspection to see what's going on with the property itself. Now, before I go on to that, this is an important time for a seller too. Termination rights with refund of earnest money is only a buyer option. A seller has no termination rights. However, a seller does have incentive during this time frame. The seller has incentive for the buyer to want to go through with the deal. After all, they went under contract with this buyer, so they want to see it through to the end. So during this due diligence time frame, the seller is like, okay, there might be some things I'm willing to consider, some concerns of yours, buyer, that I'm willing to address because I've got incentive. I want you to go through with the deal. I chose your contract. We negotiated and I like it and I want to sell the house. So on the seller side, we've got incentive. I want you to remember that. I'm going to come back to that. On the buyer side, they're checking it out to see if they're going to option to go through with it or option to terminate and get their earnest money back. Before I even go on, just a couple, well, you know what, I'm going to come back to that because in the interest of time. I do have it's one special stipulation in here. Agents, just know I can discuss this at the end if we have time or at another time. If you are showing a property and something like the utilities are not on, which would mean a buyer cannot perform their due diligence, or you know the seller has completed a seller's disclosure statement, but it hasn't been provided, and the buyer really wants to see that. Or the property is in an HOA in a community, but you have no idea what the fees are because the seller has not yet provided the community association disclosure exhibit. If there is something important that the buyer needs in order to fulfill their obligations during this option timeframe or due diligence timeframe, then again, I'm not going to address it in depth, but I do have a special stipulation to write because you want the buyer to preserve their time frame. So once they get that, let's say the HOA, let's say we have no idea what the HOA fees are going to be, and they might end up being too expensive. Well, you don't want a buyer to spend money on an inspection if they're not going to be able to get the house for another reason. But if it is within their financial tolerance, then they do want to have it inspected. So again, I'm not going to belabor this point, but I have an example here and I have the special stipulation right here to use. Due diligence to begin upon binding agreement date and extend for X number of days after buyers, for example, receipt of written notification, all utilities are on or operational. Again, you want it to begin at due diligence because if you never get it, you want to be able to have the buyer terminate and get their earnest money back. But anyway, I can go more in depth into that. So now let's say let me go down here. Let me go all the way down here. So a buyer has an inspection done. They have found some issues that they would like the seller to address. There's two types of issues. There are things that, you know what, we still love the house, but I'm paying a lot of money for the house. There's a couple of things we found. It would be really, really nice if the seller would go ahead and pay for those so it's not an additional expense for me. Like rotten wood around the windows that's, the windows have been leaking a little bit, so the wood's gotten rotten. I'd like for that wood to be replaced and repainted. The polarity in the GFCI outlets in the bathroom is reversed. I need that replaced. There is a couple of, there's a bedroom, one of the bedrooms where it is painted fuchsia hot pink, and I really would like for you guys to paint that neutral. Those are certain things that Yeah, it would be really nice if the seller does that because I just really don't. It needs to be cleaned. It needs the carpets need to be cleaned. The HVAC needs to be serviced. I didn't get any indication that it's pooping out, but it really would be good. Things like that would be nice if the seller would pay for, but I'm not going to terminate the contract. I'll still go through with it. So that's one type of repair. The other type of issue that comes up are what I call make it or break it issues. Okay, Dana, what does that mean? Those are issues that if the seller does not pay for those things, I can't afford it. I cannot purchase this home because I do not have the money or I can't get it through the loan. I don't have the money to pay for it. So those make it or break it issues are things like it needs a new roof. The structure is wonky and the structure needs to be leveled up. The driveway has a big old huge crack in it and I cannot afford to do that. It needs to be fixed. It needs a new HVAC system. I can't afford that. I can't do that. So those are the two types of repairs, just general repairs. It would be nice if the seller paid for and make it or break it issues. I'm going to come back to that, but I just want you to understand what kinds of things we deal with on an amendment to address concerns. So while we're here on this amendment, I want you to know two things built in, pre-printed, and I have them underlined for you. This is the only amendment in the GAR, Georgia Association of Realtors contract package that has a built-in time limit. What do you mean, Dana? Well, it's written right there in the first paragraph. This amendment is intended to set forth an agreement between the parties relative to concerns raised by a buyer during the due diligence period. If this amendment does not become effective during the due diligence period, it shall become null and void and of no legal force and effect. What does that mean? So what does it mean to become effective during the due diligence period? That means both parties have signed and the last party to sign agreeing to the terms has sent notice of their acceptance to the party that made the offer. For example, buyer sends an amendment to the seller signs it. At that point, we have an accepted amendment, but it's not binding. The seller then has to send notice of their acceptance of the amendment back to the buyer. That becomes binding, or in the verbiage here, effective. Now, it says if we don't get that before the end of the due diligence period, which was negotiated in the purchase and sale agreement, then it becomes null and void and of no legal force and effect. In other words, let's say the buyer sends it to the seller. Let's say the seller signs it, but doesn't agree or doesn't send it back to the buyer until after their due diligence period has expired. What this sentence means is, okay, buyer's agents, the seller is no longer obligated to do these repair issues or whatever's on here that they agreed to do because it was not agreed to and sent back binding before the end of due diligence. So here's a note, agent note, point of practice. If you have an amendment to address concerns that the seller agrees to, but they didn't send it back to the buyer until after due diligence, you need to immediately pull out a general amendment and rewrite all of those terms and get the seller to agree. Because if this is not done prior to the end of due diligence, seller is not required. It says void. This amendment is void and of no legal force and effect. Seller is absolutely not contractually required to do those issues. Now, let's get to the incentive part. Again, the seller can say, yes, I'll take care of those things, but in exchange, your due diligence period is going to terminate early. That's the next little paragraph here. In consideration of seller agreeing to address certain concerns with the buyer with the property, all parties agree if this amendment is signed by buyer and seller and delivered to both parties, again, prior to the expiration of due diligence, The remainder of the buyer's due diligence shall or shall not terminate. Y'all don't leave that blank. Make sure you check one of those. Buyer side, you're going to put shall not. Seller side, you're probably going to want to put shall. So the seller can say, look, buyer, I'll do all, let's say buyer and seller have a 10-day due diligence period. Buyer gets the inspection done. They send this amendment day 4 after binding agreement date. Seller says, yep, I'll do it. But that's it. You have no more right to terminate for any or no reason. So the seller can, buyer and seller can negotiate if the due diligence periods ends with the seller agreeing to fulfill all those responsibilities. Now, let's go back here. So again, you're like, why would a seller do anything? Well, even if a seller is saying, I'm selling it as is, well, there are certain things a seller doesn't consider. Like, yeah, you know what? I'll have the carpets cleaned. I was going to do that anyway. So, or no problem to replace that wood and paint it. That's not a big deal. So there's certain things, buyer's agents and listing agents, a seller might say, I'm selling it as is, that they just aren't, when they sign the listing agreement, they might not even be thinking about little things that, well, of course I'll do that. That's not a big deal. So don't get upset. So listing agents, don't get upset and tell your sellers not to get upset when a buyer sends an amendment. They're just asking. It never hurts to ask. The seller can always say no. Oh, one more thing before I move on. If a buyer and a seller are negotiating through this amendment and you're getting close to the end of your due diligence time frame, an open amendment that you're negotiating does not extend the due diligence time frame. Your due diligence is a drop dead time frame. So if it's little things the buyer doesn't mind, the buyer still wants the house, but just would have been nice, don't terminate and have the buyer go through with it. If it is a make it or break it issue, and you're coming to the end of your due diligence period, remember, make it or break it issue, the buyer cannot afford to go through with this home. And if the seller doesn't pay for it, for example, a new roof, new HVAC, then buyer's agents, you need to protect your buyers. GAR has a special stipulation number 302. Make sure to use, it was revised in 2025. Make sure to use the revised version. I'm going to read it to you. It says, in the event this amendment to address concerns with the property is not accepted by the seller and delivered back to the buyer by 2 minutes prior to the end of the due diligence period, this amendment to address concerns with the property shall serve as notice to terminate this agreement effective 1 minute prior to the end of the due diligence period. So let me talk about the legalese. The 2 minutes and the 1 minute, that is because all of that has to happen prior to the end of the due diligence period, which is 11:59 p.m., last day of due diligence, unless they've agreed to in writing otherwise. So this is just legalese because there has to be 2 actions, a buyer action and a seller action, and all that has to occur prior to 11:59. So that's why GAR for 2025 has amended, updated this special stipulation to legally add in those time frames so that the buyer really is terminating before 11:59 and not after, to protect their earnest money. So that's a little, don't even worry about that. Just remember, if it is a make it or break it issue and you have not heard from the seller, then you are going to want to terminate this contract on behalf of your buyer before the end of due diligence in order to protect their earnest money. So this special stipulation will protect your buyer's earnest money, but you're only going to use it for make it or break it issues. Like I said, if it's reverse polarity or rotten wood or cleaning, you don't want to terminate this contract on behalf of your buyer. They're willing. It would have been nice if the seller would have paid for it, but they're willing to purchase the home with those. So make sure to use that GAR special stipulation if it is a make it or break it issue. Now, What about other things? Let me go back to the special stipulations we have for you to consider. As a broker, and Ming and Alan can also attest to this, you have issues with repairs, as I mentioned at the beginning, day of closing, final walkthrough, even before that. Why? Well, let's say a buyer and a seller did negotiate on an amendment to address concerns that the seller was going to perform certain repairs. Sellers generally want to take care of them as inexpensively and expediently as possible. Buyers want them done as best, most, not necessarily most expensive, but typically a buyer's idea of a repair being done is not the same as a seller's idea of the repair being done. They can be, but generally speaking, that's where the issues come in. So how do you avoid this? Well, generally speaking, when you're writing a special stipulation, you need to address, well, I'll get to that in a minute. The best way to handle this is to not even have them do repairs. My gosh, Dana, why? Why do you say that? Well, because of what I just said. Usually the repairs done are fine for the seller. They're leaving the house anyway, but not good enough for a buyer, and you have issues. So the best way by far to handle any repair items is for a seller to pay for them at closing by paying a specific vendor. So here's the special stipulation. At closing, from seller's proceeds, seller to pay ABC HVAC company, whatever, the name of the vendor, X amount of dollars. Why is this the best way? Well, here are the reasons below. Number one, the seller is not responsible for doing any of the repairs. So you are not going to get any of the issues. It's not good enough. It's not done well enough. It was never done. You had your brother do it, not a professional perform that repair. Second, for the seller doesn't have to come out of pocket. The seller doesn't have to pay for it until closing from their proceeds. This buyer may not close. So that's a definite benefit, listing agents, to the seller. You don't have to pay for something that, if this contract falls through and you get another contract, might not be an issue in another contract. Buyer side, what's the benefit to you? Well, buyers, you have decision over the vendor that's going to perform that repair. You may hire whomever you choose. Buyer, you can schedule the work at your convenience when it fits your schedule. Buyer, you get all the warranties in your name. Buyer, let's say, I don't know, let's say whatever it is, the seller agreed to pay for, let's say it's a pool pump. Let's say it's a swimming pool, and the seller agreed to pay Pools R Us $1,000 to replace the pool pump. Okay, buyers, you can hire that. Say you're choosing the pool company. Well, you can say, okay, guess what? While you're here, I also need the saltwater tanks redone. I want it cleaned. I want it shocked. I want blah, blah, blah. Well, buyers, you can add on additional work for that pool company. You already have a check made payable to that pool company that you chose for the motor issue, but you can add on whatever additional work you want. And for both parties, guess what? It does not impact the loan. It is not a financial contribution from a seller to a buyer, because various loans, a buyer can only receive a top dollar amount. There is a cap on the amount of financial contribution a buyer can receive from any outside source, sellers, agents, commission, rebate, all those kinds of things. So this stipulation doesn't even impact a buyer's loan. The lender, it doesn't impact the lender at all. So again, what happens? You figure out the repairs. Buyer's agents, you're going to get with your buyer and come up with some vendors and get some estimates, and then so you your buyer has to get some work done within that before the end of due diligence. And on the amendment to address concerns, or actually it could be on a general amendment too, you would add at closing from seller's proceeds, seller to pay whatever vendor X amount of dollars. That is by far, you avoid all the arguments, and for all of the reasons I elucidated here, that is by far the best way to handle repair issues. You could also come down in sale price, but that impacts compensation, and that, depending on how far you are in the loan process, that could make it go back through underwriting. You could have the seller make a contribution to buyer's closing costs. Again, depending where you are in outside contributions to a buyer and how far the buyer is in the loan process, that could cause delays in underwriting or not be allowed. So again, this is by far the best way. But let's say the repairs have to be done. Well, let's look at a couple of other special stipulations to handle that. In any special stipulation, but especially with repairs, you need to think about, buyer's agents, you need to think about what are the so a seller might agree to it up front, but what are the consequences if the seller doesn't do them? Have you ever had a seller not do something they said they were going to do? Yes, they do. Are they bad people? No. Certain circumstances come in the way. The seller could have had a financial crisis and now the seller can't afford to do it. Or the appraisal could have come in low and the seller made a different concession on the appraisal, but they're like, I'm going to make a concession on the sale price, but I'm not doing those repairs. Or a seller just doesn't do them for a variety of reasons. Well, some buyer's agents and buyers think that automatically gives the buyer the right to terminate the contract and get their earnest money back. Nope, that is not an automatic. So you need to write in, this is all special stipulations, how do you know when it's done? What is the time frame? And what are the consequences for non-performance of a special stipulation? So this special stipulation has been written by closing attorney Amy Davis of Davis and Associates. And it states, all parties agree that repair work contemplated and agreed upon herein shall be completed not less than 5 business days prior to the closing dated of whatever the closing date is. You could probably just put closing date because that might get extended. So before I go on, you want them done before the day of closing. You want them done in enough time where the buyer can do a walkthrough and check on the repairs if they're done, perhaps have an inspector back, so forth and so on. So one thing that's important is a certain number of days before closing. Okay, let's continue. All work shall be completed by vendors licensed in the state of Georgia through the proper state licensing board to complete the work required herein. Now, definitely for electrician stuff, they get licensed. But like carpentry stuff, cleaning, things like that, they're not necessarily licensed, but you want to have some, the intent is to not have the seller's brother or fix it themselves if it's something that really requires, especially electricity, or perhaps plumbing. So all work shall be completed by vendors licensed in the state of Georgia through the proper state licensing board to complete the work required herein. Seller shall provide to buyer at least 5 days prior to closing evidence of buyer's license to do repair work, invoices, and paid receipts for all work completed. Now, here are the consequences. Should the seller not complete the work required herein at least 5 days in advance of closing, buyers shall have the right to either, number one, immediately hire vendors of buyer's choice and have the work completed at seller's expense to be paid at time of closing from seller's proceeds, or two, terminate the contract agreement with full refund of all earnest money deposits. Here is so one thing is, if it doesn't get done, buyer can hire work, the vendors, and again, it gets paid for from the seller's proceeds at closing. Here's another one. This verbiage is from the special stipulations in the RE forms contract. The parties agree that the repairs the seller has agreed to complete under the contract may not be complete as of the date of closing. In that event, no later than X number of days after closing, the repair completion date, seller shall complete all repairs to the property herein. It is understood and agreed that the seller, in showing of good faith, shall deposit at closing X amount of dollars, the repair funds, with blank, the security holder. That could be a closing attorney or one of the brokers, as security for completion of said repairs. As long as seller completes or causes to complete all repairs no later than midnight of the repair completion date, the repair fund shall be returned to the seller within whatever, 2 or 3 days of the repair completion date, or submission of proof of the repairs to the buyer, whichever comes first. Should the seller fail to timely complete said repairs, buyer shall then be entitled to the repair funds as liquidated damages. Should a dispute arise as to the disbursement of the repair funds, the security holder shall be entitled to the same rights, remedies, indemnities, etc., as any escrow agent or holder of earnest money described in the contract. So, in other words, the seller agrees to escrow a certain amount of money for those repairs to be done. If they're not done as of the date of closing, then the seller agrees to have those repairs done if and pay for them. If not, then this pile of money gets dispersed to the buyer, so then the buyer can then pay for those repairs. And again, this is just what I had on that pre-printed on that exhibit, the 2025 revision of if it is a make it or break it issue. And as always, check with your broker prior to using any of the special stipulations. I just have one more comment. Repair issues, if you do have a buyer and a seller that do negotiate for repairs, and they are not, if you don't use one of these special stipulations or one of these things I've talked about, buyer does not necessarily have termination rights with getting their earnest money back. And if you close without them being done, repairs do not automatically survive closing, meaning a seller is not legally obligated to do them if the buyer closes. So you guys, you are stuck in a conundrum if you do not really protect your parties. So if you do negotiate for repairs, you also want to add this provision shall survive closing so that the seller is legally obligated to complete those issues after closing. If not, the sellers, then the buyer opts to close, then the seller isn't legally required to do them. And you're like, well, Dana, you just told me the buyer can't terminate. The buyer might be in default if the buyer terminates. So you need to again address in the amendment what happens, consequences, if the seller does not perform, doesn't do the repairs. Termination rights with a refund of earnest money, escrowing money, or like I say, it is by far best to handle it financially and not even address the repair issues in and of themselves. The end.
Awesome.
Anyone have a question for Dana? Because I can tell you right now, it's not a problem until it becomes a problem. And especially when you start at the last minute, the buyer's not happy and they're looking at you like, fix it. And you're like, whoa, I didn't do it. I just know that is a situation that can be prevented if we have the proper language up front.
Well, I see a lot of times that we expect everyone to act trustworthy, honorably, and sometimes we get surprised when they don't, which is why how we write these amendments to address repairs and these kind of things are so important because, like Ming said, It's not a problem till it's a problem. So, any questions you have for Dana?
I've got one, Alan.
Hit us, Mark.
So, Dana, I've had two instances where I represented the buyer, and the seller did not want to sign the ATAC with the tagline on the end saying that we could terminate if they didn't do the work. How do you address that?
What was it? Was it that the buyer? This if the buyer could terminate if they didn't do the work?
Right.
I mean, you need to address that with the buyer. I mean, the other option would be to escrow money, but so the buyer is like, okay, it would depend on the repair issues, but the buyer needs to understand they can't terminate and get their earnest money back if the seller doesn't do it. I would ask the listing agent, why is the seller considering not doing them? Why would a seller not agree to do that? Why would a seller not agree that a buyer can terminate and get their earnest money back if the seller has agreed to do the repairs?
That was my concern. And what I ended up doing was telling them, then we'll just walk, because there's nothing to make you do the work if we don't say what the consequence is if you don't do the work.
Right.
And I guess after they went and talked to their broker, they decided they'd go with it. But I couldn't understand why they would even push back on that in the first place.
Yeah, I would definitely have that discussion. I would look at the repairs. I would have that discussion with the buyer that, are you willing to go to closing if the seller changes their mind and doesn't do these at closing? Because you can't terminate at that point.
And they weren't.
Let it be the buyer's decision. And here's the thing too. You buyer's agents, if a seller isn't doing something and it's really important to your buyer, terminate the contract before the end of due diligence and protect that earnest money. Guess what? If the listing agent comes back and says, we're in a different market and the cycle is changing. So we're still probably, Alan can answer this better than I can. We're still probably in a seller's market, but the cycle is changing. We're seeing listing prices coming down. We're seeing way more seller concessions. So buyers, they don't rule the roost right now, but they are getting more of their contract requests honored by a seller. So you can always terminate the contract. And then guess what? And then a listing agent, buyer's agent, y'all talk to your clients, you work it out. And the listing agent could say, hey, guess what? The seller, they agreed they'll do it, blah, 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 or handle it financially, find another way to handle it. And then guess what? Just reinstate the contract. You can do that. But buyer's agents, please protect that buyer's earnest money. Go ahead and terminate. That due diligence time frame is a drop dead time frame. And we have a lot of agents and a lot of buyers that think, oh, well, we're negotiating, so it's extended. No, there's no incentive for a seller to do anything after the end of due diligence, because at that point, if a buyer terminates, again, not accounting for a financing or appraisal contingency or any other contingency, buyers lost their earnest money. Now, sellers don't put their houses up on the market just to collect earnest money. They want to sell their home. But buyers agents, you guys, and also I've had two issues these past 2 weeks. Ming and Ellen, I got one to share with y'all later, where timeframes are, the buyers have stated they were not aware of the timeframes. Now they are signing the contract, and the GAR purchase and sale agreement 2 years ago added in all bold print above the signature lines. Have you read this? Do you understand it? Do you agree with it? We still have buyers saying, my agent didn't explain it to me. I didn't understand. I don't agree. Sorry, you're over the age of 18 purchasing a home. It's not like your phone is updating and you have to agree to updated terms to have your phone work. You're buying hundreds and hundreds of $1,000 home. So, but agents, protect yourself and provide some customer service to your people. GAR has a form of important timeframes in the contract. Y'all fill that out after you go under contract. Send it to the co-op agent. What a nice professional co-op thing to do. Send it to your own people and say, look, okay, we went binding today, 6/30/25, and our due diligence period is in 7 days. So on July 7th at 11:59 p.m., you are either going through with it or you have to terminate before that time if you want to protect your earnest money. But you need to put that in writing because you need to be able to demonstrate you put that in writing. I would have the conversation, but I would also follow up in writing with that GAR form, with an email. And then guess what? On 6/6/25, I'm also going to email, okay, our deadline, we have until 11:59 p.m. tomorrow. What do you want to do? Have you checked out everything? Have you checked out hazard insurance? Have you checked out if you need flood insurance? Have you checked out the zoning? Have you driven the commute? Have you gotten up and gone to that place at 7 a.m. and you try to make a left turn across traffic with no red light? It takes you 45 minutes to get out of the subdivision to get to work. Those kinds of things. Those are the things, as well as, and in this situation, Mark, it would be, okay, the seller's not willing to agree that you can terminate, get their earnest money back. I don't know what that means. I don't know what's going on in their head. They agreed to it now, but are you willing right now? Yes, it would be nice if the seller pays for those, if the seller does those repairs. If the seller does not do those repairs, are you willing to still close? Because you cannot terminate. If not, we need to terminate before the end of due diligence. So those are the conversations you agents need to have with your people before the time, especially before the end of due diligence.
Yep. We had a question asked, what was the name of that document? It's F-264, reminder of important dates on there. I also find that sometimes we think, we've had buyer's agents tell us before, well, I sent over the amendment before midnight. All parties have to sign. Just because you as a buyer's agent sends over an amendment to address repairs, if the seller doesn't sign off, you haven't done anything, right? It's just like that is not, that doesn't count. We have to get it back and get it binding. And then, yeah,
I was just gonna say, it's not only a seller agreeing, you guys, amendments, they work just like purchase and sale agreements. It's notice of acceptance. It has to be signed and sent back. And I just did a video tip on this. I've got a whole separate YouTube channel, Real Estate Made Crystal Clear, just like Ming and Alan have Real Estate Backstory. And I just did a video on this that completely lost my train of thought. Oh, that amendments don't have time limits. You need to add one in, or you need to withdraw an amendment before it is binding. But an amendment where the terms are binding upon the parties, it works the same way as offers and counter offers. And somebody asked for the handout. I just put the PDF in the chat, and I'll also email it to Ming and Alan. But you guys can download that from the chat, that that verbiage that I used. But go ahead, Alan.
Oh, no,
Partner, I'm so sorry. I have already uploaded reference section. Is under contract tips. So for our agents, it's up there already. Thank you, Dana, for sharing that always. And the only thing I do want to point out, so I just had experience with a agent who's been in business for about 20 years or more. So I had an ATAC as well. And one of the language I basically stipulate, if this ATAC is not accepted 1 minute prior to expiration of due diligence period, this ATAC serve as a unilateral TNR. So the agent was trying to get smart with me and down the road, and while we negotiated initially after the due diligence period, and then she decided after about a day, she said, well, we're not going to do anything right now. We're going to retract our offer to do the repairs because we just want to move forward since you guys are past your due diligence period. And I've quickly reminded her that I had a language in there that the ATAC serve as a unilateral TNR, so she can pull that trick on me. Because a lot of some of your seller's agent would also pull the trick like, well, you're past your due diligence, so sorry, we'll move on, or your buyer lose their earnest money. No, even though this is a seasoned agent, I don't think she's ever seen that language. And so therefore she said, well, I'm gonna consult my broker. You might want to consult yours. I said, I am the brokers. But anyways, but just want you to know that it is important for that language in there, and it is important for you to have your buyer's consultation to let them know what's negotiable and what's not negotiable. Because at the end of the day, I always tell my agent it's easier to reinstate a contract than it is to lose a buyer's earnest money. So
Yep.
we had to reinstate that contract, and after she figured out what I did, and so she did agree to the repairs like we thought she would.
And again, we are in a cycling market right now. So 2 years ago, no way. If you terminated, you were done. You could not reinstate. The seller had 3 other contracts waiting in the wings. But this is a different market. And regardless of that, you guys, you need to talk to those buyers and see what they're willing to live with and what they're not willing to live with. Because when you're buying something, it's like, yes, I mean it's just like buying a car. I want all the bells and whistles, all the bells and whistles. But if I end up getting a car, once they move into the house, some of those things you're like, oh yeah, okay, I got money to paint a room. Well, I never painted the room. I decided I like fuchsia. So there's certain things that people are really willing to live with, but they're like, I want it done. It comes down to money. I don't want to pay for it. But if they end up having to pay for it, they end up living with it. So even on buyer's side, it's not always a make it or break it deal. It would just be nice if I didn't have to take care of that. Guess what? I would like for the seller to pay for a cleaning, but if not, I'll clean it. It'd be nice for them to pay for professional cleaning. If not, guess what? I'll go clean it myself before I move in. So, these are discussions. And the other thing I would say when negotiating anything, but especially on this amendment to address concerns, agents on both sides, y'all, it's not your home. It's not your money. You are not moving into that house. Don't get so possessive and emotional over these issues you are negotiating. You are just agents. Y'all are supposed to be working together to help the buyers and the sellers come together and get over those hurdles and those issues. You're not supposed to be, it's not duking it out. My buyer wants this, my seller wants that. No, it's the principle of the thing. No, that's not our agent's role. You guys, you are middle management. You are here to help the buyers and the sellers get over those humps and hurdles, help coordinate the vendors and the lenders and the appraisers and the inspectors and the closing attorney. You are here to make all of that work seamlessly. That is not your job, not to get so emotionally attached to the seller won't pay for a carpet cleaning. How dare they? Really? You're going to lose that home for the buyer because of that? Talk to the buyer. It's like, okay, or guess what? As a closing gift, go pay for a carpet cleaning, whatever. But my point is, when you are having these discussions, you as the buyer's agent and you as the seller's agent and the brokers involved, we are here to help smooth those highs and those lows and to get it to work together, not to create those deeper divisions and deeper arguments.
Yeah, if I could add one other thing, that would be, look, a lot of times we have 5-7 days due diligence. And in a lot of cases, I see we wait until the last day, 5 o'clock on the last day of due diligence to try and work these things out. You have, like for me, I think it's almost customer service, right? As soon as we know what we need to know, we need to start making some decisions and we need to be able to send these things over. You leave everyone in limbo until you actually get through the whole due diligence. your amendments to address repairs, like, please don't sit on it. There's no need to sit back and wait until the last day of due diligence. You don't have a chance to kind of go back and forth. The sellers think about it, the buyers think about it, they'll be able to work back and forth. You put yourself under a time frame that you shouldn't be putting yourself in. You have a lot of cases, I'm not saying this every single time, but a lot of cases we have enough time to negotiate back and forth. But if you're waiting to the last day at 7 o'clock at night, you're really limited. Is that agent available? Are the sellers available? Are the buyers available? So please don't put yourself in a position where you have to wait to where you're waiting to the last minute, and then it's all the Hail Marys that we're trying to get pushed through.
Just one more comment, that Amy Davis, repair special stipulation, it does talk about licensed contractors, licensed in the state of Georgia, proof of licensing. I'm sharing that with you because that was shared with me by a closing attorney. But one thing to keep in mind, you buyer's agents, if you do negotiate for, if the seller does agree or the buyer is requesting certain repairs, again, use your common sense. If it's electrical, you're probably going to want to have a licensed electrician. You don't want the house burning down by somebody doing it. If it is,
Yeah, outlet covers.
yeah, outlet covers, even replacing a toilet. I can replace a toilet. You just have to get the wax ring. I need help with my husband to hold it. I can't hold it and do it at the same time. But, that's a DIY homeowner type thing that you can do. You don't need a licensed plumber to replace a toilet. Carpentry work, like, hey, the railing on the stairs needs to be secured. A homeowner can do that. Shoring up the deck, probably want a deck company. Now again, use your common sense. Deck company, fence company, they're not, you don't get a license to be a fencing company. But so when you wouldn't ask for a license in Georgia for a fencing company to replace a couple of the missing boards in a fence, but you would ask something like a fencing company whose business I can readily find on Google. Something like that to prove it's an actual company. And listing agents, let's say your homeowner is a master carpenter or works for a fencing company, and listing agents say, hey, look, the homeowner works for a fencing company. He can do it himself. Great. So use some common sense. These are the kinds of things that, don't get so emotional and so strict. Guess what? If something needs to be repainted, I can repaint it. You know what I mean? Like if it's, I don't know. I'm just saying, use some common sense that not every vendor to do any concerns with house needs to be licensed. If it's something electrical, probably I want somebody licensed. HVAC work, I probably want someone, I don't even know if you need a license to do HVAC work, but again, a company, and that would be a company I can readily find in Google, because that way it's you might not have heard of the company. It could be a small company, but it's a real company, not just somebody's brother, and you can create a fake invoice with Microsoft Word. So those are the kinds of things. Use some common sense that, yeah, it's fine if the seller does it, like clean. Okay, if it's not a deep cleaning, just clean the house. So just things like that you want to use some common sense about.
Yeah. Anybody got other questions for Dana, or for any of us, really?
Davis asked again, what's the GAR form again? You want to type it in the chat?
F-264.
I'll type it.
Okay.
Got it.
That's a reminder of important dates. You guys, that is, I teach also, or encourage that you guys, once you go under contract, fill that out. And you'll see, if you've never looked at that form, it's a great form. It has binding agreement date, due diligence. So what date is that? All the contingencies, so forth and so on. Fill that out. Keep a copy for yourself so you keep on track. Send it to the person with whom you're working, your buyer or your seller. And guess what, y'all? Send it to your co-op agent. Can you imagine receiving that from the other agent? Hey, I just did a courtesy. I just wanted to share this with you so we're all on the same page. We're all you guys, real estate's really an interesting field. When you think about, I represent the buyer, I represent the seller, but it's not antithetical. You're not on opposite sides. It's really interesting because we're all working towards the same goal. So agents and brokers, we're working towards the same thing. So be on the same side. Go ahead and provide customer service to your co-op agent. What a nice thing. Oh my gosh, that's so awesome. Thank you. And let me tell you something. If you go into every transaction with the mindset that your co-op agent is your client just as much as your buyer and your seller, I guarantee you're going to have a smoother deal. And you are probably more likely to do another deal with that co-op agent before you do another deal with your actual public person. So treat your co-op agent as a client or customer as well. And if you have that mindset, you are definitely going to have a smoother transaction. And when hurdles, okay, whew, got through due diligence, got through these repair issues, appraisal. You're going to have a much better time of working together, cooperating to get the buyers and the sellers what they really want, which is the buyer to buy the house and the seller to sell the house.
Perfect. Well, thank you
Bingo.
so much, Dana. We appreciate taking the time out this morning and going with our agents and Greater Atlanta all across and go over this and the importance of repairs so our client does not suffer as a consequence. So we appreciate you always.
All right, guys. Thanks so much. Have a great week. If we can be of any service, please call, text, smoke signals. We'll answer it all. So bye, guys. We love y'all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you again, Dana.
Take
everybody.
care.
Bye.